Good morning, everyone. Buen domingo a todos. The third Sunday of Advent, every year, although there are different readings every year on the Gospel, always sort of focus on John the Baptist's message in preparation for the appearance of Christ. El tercer domingo siempre tiene este aspecto de leer el Evangelio, algunos de los evangelios que nos muestran a San Juan Bautista como el camino de preparación. I'd like to say a little bit about that. How it is that John the Baptist, as a person, but also as a figure, is the final preparation for the coming of Christ. He sort of sums everything up and what that kind of means for us. Es importante porque Juan Bautista mismo dijo, yo no soy el Mesías. John the Baptist himself said, I'm not the Messiah. I prepare the way. We hear that a lot, no? Especially during Advent. Él viene para preparar el camino, pero ¿qué significa eso? I mean, what is that really? Preparing the way that John the Baptist sort of does. And I guess the way to kind of describe this is that God, since the very beginning of his dealing with the human race after sin entered the world, there's a certain order in the way he does things, no? And you have to see it from kind of a distance to kind of see how that unfolds. El punto es que desde cuando Dios empezó a tratar con los seres humanos después del pecado, hay un orden de su manera de instruirnos. It's not like haphazard or sort of chaotic. There's a rhythm in a certain way, and it shows itself in many, many different ways. But in some ways, the most dramatic sort of way we kind of get a glimpse as to what the order of things is. No, Dios es un Dios de orden, como dice San Pablo. God is a God of order. For example, you are familiar, we have the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, el libro de los Proverbios. No es un libro que leemos mucho en liturgia, pero de vez en cuando. It's a book that we don't read real often in the liturgy, but we do. It's the book of Proverbs, and it's a beautiful book. It's sort of basically the advice of the wise to the young. And so it's sort of a basic book of moral instruction. And the wise man in this particular book speaks to the whole of Israel, but in a certain way, it's a very personal book. Hijo mío, my son, don't cheat people. Don't go the way of the crooked-hearted. It's sort of a basic ordering of things. La purificación del corazón en Proverbios. It's an important book in the monastic tradition. En la tradición monástica, este libro de Proverbios es como el primer libro que el monje tiene que estudiar. In the monastic tradition, the book of Proverbs is like the first book the young monk has to study because it's about straightening his heart or her heart, straightening the heart in the way of basically the commandments. It's very practical, but it's very focused because it's very realistic. It's realistic that even in the ancient times, there were many things that would lead the heart astray. I'll just read you a little passage from the book, first chapter of Proverbs. The wise man says to my son, walk not in the way of them that do wicked things. Beware of those who entice you and say, come with us. Let us lie in wait on the honest man and let us ambush him and take his money. My son, do not do this. Muy práctico, ¿no? Hijo mío, te van a invitar a que acompañes a los malos a defraudar a lo inocente. No hagas eso. Don't do that. That's not the way of the commandments. It's not the way of the Lord. Keep your heart straight. Enderezar el corazón es como el mensaje principal de este libro de Proverbios. Yo lo más menciono porque el libro es como símbolo también del mensaje de Juan Bautista. There's a lot of books, by the way, in the Old Testament that talk about these things, but it's very practical. It says, if you want to draw close to the Lord, follow the commandments. And as Jesus said many times in the gospel, you know what the commandments are. You shall not steal, you shall not defraud your neighbor, you shall not lie, you shall not kill. All those basic things that we kind of know what these are. But it's the beginning, ¿no? Es el principio del camino hacia el Señor. The beginning of the way of the Lord. Y también es obra de Dios. It's God who reminds us of these things. So it's all about grace. It's not about how strong we are or how intelligent we are. It's about God who reminds us, because the commandments were given to Moses and then to the people of Israel. But they needed constantly to be reminded. So do not, my son, do not walk in the way of them that do wicked things, especially those who seek to shed blood. That's also there. No busquen compañía de los que quieren derramar sangre de los inocentes. No hagan eso, porque eso no es de Dios. Okay. It's kind of the beginning book. Because to make straight the path, when the prophet Isaiah, we heard it last week, and it's repeated during Advent a lot, John the Baptist is the one that the prophet had announced who would open up the path for the Messiah to come. He wasn't the Messiah. Juan Bautista decía, yo no soy el Mesías, pero preparo su camino. ¿Y qué significa eso? What does that mean? He prepares the way. Well, in the gospel today, we get a very practical sense. In some ways, John the Baptist takes the figure of the wise who's giving advice to those who seek the way of the Lord. El camino del Señor es camino hacia el Señor. The way of the Lord, the commandments, is the first steps to the Lord. And so, the gospel today from St. Luke tells us, many asked John the Baptist questions, what are we supposed to do? Because it was the time and they knew that something was stirring in the wind, so to speak, of the coming of the Messiah. And so John the Baptist, it's a very practical advice. There's 3 pieces of advice he gives here, and each one sort of touches a different aspect of the commandments. For those of you who have 2 tunics, give one of them to somebody who doesn't have one. That's what he says. In other words, it's not going to help you to have 10 tunics in your closet if there are 9 people outside who are cold. That's in the commandments and that's in the prophets. He's not, no está inventando cosas. Esto viene de los profetas y de los mandamientos. And then the tax collectors, los publicanos, the tax collectors, they say, what are we supposed to do? You know, everybody has a station in life. We all have different jobs, so to speak. ¿Qué debo de hacer yo? Que soy, pues, recaudador de impuestos. No cobren más de lo establecido. Don't charge more than is established or what is just. In other words, because this was very common in the ancient world, and I do not say it's completely disappeared, that someone will say, you owe this much, when actually they owe less than that, and they keep the part on top. Hijo mío, no hagas esto. It's like John the Baptist is saying, like the wise man in Proverbs, my son, do not do this. You take advantage of people, you take from them what is unjust. By the way, that's why tax collectors in the time of Jesus were very unpopular. Matthew, remember Matthew? He was a tax collector. People were really horrified that Jesus went to stay at his house. Mas para que sepan, Jesus has a little bit different thing going on there. And finally, and the 3, I'm sure many people came to John the Baptist. Muchos llegaron con Juan Bautista, pero el evangelista nos da los 3 ejemplos. And finally, the soldiers. The soldiers, they could have been soldiers of the temple. They could have been even the Roman soldiers who occupied Israel at the time. Y nosotros, what are we supposed to do? Do not extort. No extorsionen a nadie. And do not denounce somebody falsely. That is, don't lie about somebody so that you can take their goods. No. Denunciar a alguien falsamente quiere decir, pues no, es que lo acusan de algo para poder quedarse con los bienes. All the ancient kings of Israel did this. And the prophets, David had to pay a price for that because he did that. In short, John the Baptist tells the soldiers, be content with your salary. Hay que quedar contento con el salario que tienes. ¿Para qué estás acusando a otros para quitarles bienes? Why do you do that? Hijo mío, no hagas esto. Son puntos sencillos de seguir el camino del justo, porque los mandamientos de Moisés y las palabras del profeta nos enseñan el camino del corazón enderezado, of a heart that is true, that is sort of, how do we put it, well put together, bien compacto, ¿no? El corazón, que es un corazón que hace la justicia y cuide del que no tiene. Punto. It's the heart that does justice and cares for the one who has no tunic. In that, you could say, is the law and the prophets. Esto es como la manera que Juan Bautista abre el camino, prepara el camino, dice el Juan, cumpliendo lo que había dicho Isaías. Hay que preparar el camino. Pues, ¿qué camino? ¿De qué estás hablando? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the wisdom of Israel, which comes from the prophets and the law. Be just and walk humbly with your God, to use one of the words of the prophet Micah. Haga la justicia, trate a otros con misericordia y camine bien derechito con tu Dios. Do justice, act mercifully, and walk humbly with your God. Es que es un resumen del camino que prepara. You could in some ways say that everything in the law, in the prophets, is the way of preparation for the coming of the Christ. Todo en los profetas y todo lo que contienen los mandamientos de Moisés es preparación, enderezar el corazón, to straighten up the heart. Remember a couple weeks ago, Jesus, when he was talking about the end times, lift up your head, stand up straight. Derechito. In that sense, we have then, in the preparation, a genuine need for us to return to the fact that we never really sort of skip over the part about basically the basic justice and compassion that the law and the prophet. We don't jump over that. It's not like it's not there anymore. It is the path. And there really is no way to really receive the newness that is Christ. La novedad de Cristo no nos va a llegar si no preparamos el camino en la manera de la justicia y de la compasión según señalado en los profetas y en los mandamientos. Hijo mío, no busques el camino de los injustos. Do not look for the path of the unjust. Pero para recibir lo que Cristo nos ofrece, hay que buscar ese camino que Juan Bautista había anunciado. And that's why it is important for us to kind of distinguish, well, if that's the beginning, like the monks start with the book of Proverbs, you could say they start with John the Baptist, so do we. We have to start with and always review, how are we doing on the justice and compassion things? Life is complicated, no digo que no, pero it makes a difference, but it makes a difference. If you look at the world and the many complications and difficulties with a just heart, then you can make a discernment as to what you can do and what you can't do, who you can help and who you can't help, in a sense of just your own limitations and the limitations of the world. But it's how you look at the world. Con un corazón enderezado, uno puede ver el mundo de otra manera, con un sentido de la responsabilidad que tengo de caminar con Dios y buscar la misericordia y practicar la justicia. This is the basic attitude with which we have to approach God and our neighbor. Y sin esto no hay camino hacia Cristo. The message of John the Baptist was very important to all four Gospels. He's in all of them because what he says is very important for us now. It wouldn't be there if it weren't important for us to hear that basic call and to ask the question of the Lord, what must I do? And the church, la iglesia no entra en la política nomás a pedir a su pueblo que hagan la justicia. Look for justice. The church doesn't enter politics by saying that. It's just the way the world is that God asks us to look at it that way. Do justice, practice mercy, walk humbly with your God. Ask God to help you make those decisions and then live it. Es formación interior del corazón enderezado. It's an interior thing, but the church cannot dispense our members, myself included, from to say, okay, the mercy thing, we don't need to do that right now. And the justice thing, well, in certain cases. La iglesia no tiene ni la autoridad de dispensar, es que en ciertos momentos la misericordia no cuenta. La compasión o la justicia nomás de vez en cuando. It's a way of life that allows us to walk humbly with our God and to be a witness. That's why the advice he gives to the three, don't extort, don't cheat, don't lie. And if you have an extra tunic, give it to somebody who doesn't. The reason this is the beginning, you say, well, gosh, this is just the beginning? Well, yeah. It's the beginning in comparison to what Christ brings, which is why it's part of Advent. Es el principio, ¿no? Es como la preparación, es como la etapa, la primera etapa de la vida acercándose a Dios. It's like the first age of the soul. Yesterday was the feast of St. John of the Cross. He talks about the ages of the soul. There's the beginner, there's the middle way, and there's union. I just mentioned that to you. John of the Cross, we should read this, porque it's everywhere. El arrepentimiento y la justicia es el primer paso. We never outgrow the first step, la etapa principal. But to prepare us for Jesus' coming, it's good for us to kind of briefly say, well, what is it about Jesus' announcement that's different than John the Baptist? Yo nomás para señalarlo, no voy. Entonces hay que preguntar, ¿qué hay en lo que dice Jesús que se distingue de Juan Bautista? Because there is something else coming. And beware, but be aware. No hay que tener conciencia que lo que ofrece Jesús es la plenitud de la gracia. La gracia está siempre presente. Grace is always present, but Jesus comes with the fullness of grace. And the fullness is meant to push us further. That's why, for example, compare what John the Baptist says today to the Sermon on the Mount, the first great sermon in the Gospel of Matthew and also in Luke. Comparar lo que dice Juan Bautista sobre qué debo de hacer con lo que dice Jesús en el Sermón de la Montaña. When somebody takes your cloak, give him your tunic as well. No, it's further. Someone slaps you on the right cheek, give him the other. Someone asks you to go a mile, go with him for 2. Lo que trae Jesús es el evangelio de la generosidad del amor, que se extiende más allá de la justicia. What Jesus brings contains, it holds, it doesn't abolish what John the Baptist and the prophets announced, but what he announces, and we just have to be realistic about this, is a more generous way. If someone puts you into service for 1 mile, go for 2. If someone takes your coat, give him your tunic also. Porque la generosidad que pide Jesús de nosotros es espejo de la generosidad de Jesús mismo. The generosity which Jesus will announce in the kingdom is the step of fullness that leads to all fullness, but it's the step really that gives us the grace to be more godlike, porque Dios es generoso. God goes beyond even what the commandments require. That it requires sometimes, and we know this, parents know this, grandparents know this, children know this, caring for their parents, we know this, love requires more than just the justice. Que el amor, y este es lo que revela Jesús, el amor pide más. Que el amor que trae Jesús en su predicación y en la cruz es el amor que se entrega por amor. Y por eso es un sacrificio. That is why what Jesus asks of us is to pay attention to the more that love requires. The more that Jesus taught, the more that Jesus lived, the more that Jesus gave when he gave his life. The more that is the way of love. And that is why Christ's gift to us is through his sacrifice, porque el amor sin sacrificio ni vale usar la palabra. Because love that doesn't contain the gift, a bit of a sacrifice, isn't really what the kind of love God is about. Por eso. But there's a fullness. I will give you life. I will give you the fullness of life. I have come that you might have love abundantly. Follow me, Jesus says. I will give you life. Follow me. Take up your cross. Lord, I don't want the cross. I just want the life. No, you have to have the cross. Porque no hay camino. We have time for that later. That's why the church has a full year of reading the gospel, right? Eso se va a desarrollar. Por lo pronto, camino de justicia. Trate de ver bien al prójimo. No extorsionen. Si tienen 2 túnicas, hay que compartir uno. We're always beginners. And by God's grace, every Advent, he opens us up a little bit more to accept into the fullness of the kingdom is the limitless generosity of Christ himself, who forgives and gives life. Nunca vamos a superar la necesidad de arrepentimiento y de la justicia y la misericordia y caminar humildemente delante de Dios. Es el camino para poder recibir la plenitud de Cristo, su amor, su entrega, su sacrificio. Porque en ese Dios creemos nosotros. Because that is the God we believe in, who gives himself until he can give no more. And that's the fullness of the kingdom. Amen.